Hi, I'm Phoenix Godwin, not homeless professor of things and person who makes this show on autonomous media. I'm going to take some of your time to show you how concepts like Western civilization and Europe are fictional concepts exclusively used to justify the very violent imperialism and colonialism which sprouted the roots of systemic racism and disparity found all around the world today. Does this sound far-fetched? Well, let's dive into the history together real quick. Let me show you what I mean. Let's start by talking about the word civilization itself. Now, I sort of accidentally went into great detail about the subject in an older video, but the important thing for us now is just to define it. There's a number of ways to define it, but more often than not, the definitions of civilization denote a specific type of human society, which includes multiple things, including record keeping, certain farming practices, hierarchical social stratification, and domesticated city living. If these things look or sound familiar to you today, it's because the particular culture or cult of civilization has conquered most of the known world in the past few hundred years. But countless other societies have existed and sustained themselves for over 130,000 years. Really more, it's just that that's how long humans have officially existed according to a lot of academia. But as far as we have any record of, the civilization style of society has only been around for roughly 10,000 years, give or take the occasional collapse here and there. In that 10,000 years' time, civilization has been spreading, spawning, splitting, enslaving, conquering, expanding, dissolving, conjoining, commodifying, coercing, stealing, trading, spending, and generally oppressing. By the time the modern calendars got to, say, sometime between 1100 and 800 BC, roughly 3,000 years ago, the influence of the world's oldest known civilizations had spread from their origins and reached the coast surrounding the entire Mediterranean, much of what we call Asia, parts of Africa, and beyond. The cultural spread of civilization developed or absorbed a lot of competing interests, various language groups, multiple forms of state, economic specializations, and various polytheistic state-supporting religions. But at this point, there's no such thing as Western civilization yet. Let's talk a little bit about cultural identity. So, for example, if you lived in a city on the coast of Andalusia 3,000 years ago, you might identify with being part of a privileged class, or you may identify with being the kind of job you performed, or your religion, or your astrological sign, or the language you spoke, or the person you were ruled by, or your family name, or the city you came from. Maybe you'd even call yourself a Phoenician. No relation. There's also a good chance you'd identify as whatever peoples you were stolen from or forced to leave, and in that case, there's also a good chance you were fully aware that you were a slave. Very early on, one of the foundations of civilization was being given the idea that being civilized made you better, and therefore often were entitled to more than people who weren't civilized. But as of yet, there was no concept of Western civilization. All civilizations traded, they all influenced each other. A lot of them colonized and spread in diverged language groups. Religious influence itself was all over the place. Still, generally speaking, civilization was civilization. To understand how this eventually changed, we have to talk about Europe, which also didn't exist yet, and is a completely made-up continent. Hey, wait a second, Phoenix. Europe definitely exists. Look at this map. They've got those flags with the stars and the boats with guns that keep people out, and they used to have Nazis, but now they have neo-Nazis, but also just regular Nazis, and fancy cheeses, and euros, and... Yeah, I mean, those things definitely exist, other me from the board, and Europe is in part defined by those very real things, but still, Europe is definitely not a continent. Real, measurable continents exist as a matter of geology. They are the major rocky plates of the Earth's surface, which also go underwater, and this is more or less what the real continents actually look like. So, how did Europe get to be known as a continent? And what does it have to do with Western civilization? Well, real quick, let's solve a history mystery. In 430 BC, a Greek historian called Herodotus compiled as much information as he could about the Oecumene, the civilized world, from as far as possible. Interestingly, even if he didn't believe the information himself, he would often still report it, though in truth he did indicate a lot of his own prejudices. This depiction represents the sum of his work at the time. It's worth noting that the upper class of ancient Greece famously didn't recognize all civilizations as civilized, zealously following the ancient tradition of asserting their version of it was that much better than everyone else's. In his writing, though, Herodotus plainly states that he had no idea why the boundaries of these continents were set where they were, depending on, of course, who you asked at the time. He had no idea why what was clearly actually one piece of land was given the name of 3 different pieces of land, And finally, he had no idea what these names represented, where they came from, or why they were first applied to these particular regions. Fortunately for us today, we actually probably have access to a lot more information about this than Herodotus did. So, what's the answer? The continents weren't originally names for land, they were names for direction. Thousands of years ago, ancient mariners of numerous cultures were navigating the Mediterranean Sea, and they had names for the different directions they would go. People didn't have magnetic compasses back then, so these directions were commonly referred to in relation to the sun. If you were going to a port on the east side of the sea, in the direction which the sun rose from, you might say you were going to Anatolia, which can be translated to the land where the sun rises. Similarly, the English word for east itself comes from ancient words that means dawn. And while there are a lot of theories as to how Africa got its name, it's interesting to note in relation to this that the Latin word for sunny is Africa, and a way you could say without shivering in ancient Greek is Afrique, and the English word for south comes from ancient words that mean sun or sunny from as far back as the Proto-Indo-European root Saul. Alternatively, if you were going to the ports on the side of the sea where the sun set, you might at one time say that you were going towards Ereb, which was used by ancient Phoenicians, among others, to mean darkness and descent, as in you were going to the land of the setting sun. You were going west. Incidentally, the English word for west also comes from the ancient words for evening. So what started off as a way for ancient naval traders to navigate around the Mediterranean Sea and its waterways in ancient civilization times, or antiquity times if you want to get fancy about it, eventually came to be interpreted and implied as regional terms for the land masses beyond. As merchants moved between different states and empires, some distinctions changed according to different languages, or became politicized, or both. For example, Anatolia came to be known as Asia, in part referencing ancient confederacies and empires which existed in that direction, like Assur. And I'm not a linguist, but maybe Assyria, but maybe not, I really don't know. But most Romans, for example, called the land south of the sea and west of the Nile Libya, not Africa. But still, let's not get too far from the point. We'll get to the Romans later. The point is that being a Westerner and being a European, in the literal sense, historically speaking, are the same thing. But even when people referred to the northwest land of the known world as Europe, nobody thought that civilizations were different from being Western or European. European culture and Western civilization still didn't exist yet. European and Western was not a cultural identity. Nobody thought of that for over 1,000 years. So again, where did the idea of Western civilization actually come from? A lot of people like to claim that ancient Greece is the birthplace of Western civilization, wherein began a long tradition of democracy and rational philosophy. But this is really ironic for a number of reasons, like just being wrong. Ancient Greeks did not create the concept of participatory social governance, commonly referred to as democracy. They didn't even make this claim. They also definitely weren't the first ones to philosophize, or really to use what we'd call rational philosophy today. They just wrote about those things a lot relative to people before them that we have records of. And they used the associated meanings behind those concepts to justify and maintain what wasn't actually a very rational or democratic society. And there was nothing continuous about their versions of these things, as most cultures we associate with the West didn't even bother to justify irrational or despotic societies for over 1,000 years after.
Be quiet! I order you to be quiet!
Order, who does he think he is?
I'm your king!
Well, I didn't vote for you.
And while the ancient Greek civilization did maintain the related tradition of seeing themselves as severely better than everyone else, and they wrote about that too, they definitely didn't see themselves as Western. And interestingly, centuries later, the Roman Empire would become bureaucratically split between the Western, Latin-speaking administrative powers and the Eastern, Greek-speaking administrative powers. But even that was purely bureaucratic and not a matter of cultural identity, still for over 1,000 years. Again, what happened? How did ancient Greece come to be associated with the West? When did Europe become more than a vague idea for a landmass based on an even more vague sense of direction? What changed? Well, the short answer is Catholicism, and the long answer is... Thank you. Oh. This isn't actually the long version, this is just another slightly longer version of the short version. But It says, 1,000 years worth of very complicated history, with often competing efforts to preserve the culture of Roman Catholic imperialism after the so-called collapse of the Western Roman Empire, which kicked off the so-called Middle Ages, but failed to coalesce in any meaningful unified way until way towards the very end of the Middle Ages. Here. Okay, let's wrap this up. I mentioned the split of the Roman Empire before. That split starts around 286 AD. But again, this is purely bureaucratic and not cultural. So, 100 years later, when Rome officially adopted Christianity as the state religion, it was adopted for the entire Roman Empire. Now, Roman history is a long, slow, complicated, bloated crawl to collapse, but it's important to remember pretty much everyone hated it. It was consistently attacked everywhere from different societies of all kinds, and also from within. Many cities, kingdoms, and peoples which were forced through Roman rule into their economy had populations and leaders which rebelled against the Romans. This happened all the time, and that's just the ones we have records of. It wasn't just common folks that were unhappy. Even the most privileged few often obsessed with improving their quality of life to the point of political assassinations. So when you see maps telling you that this is the territory of the Roman Empire at X time, you have to remember that there were a lot of people who probably disagreed with that. And the primary reason we accept these mapped regions as truth now is because of lots and lots of killing. So eventually, this pressure results in what's called by some to be the collapse of the Roman Empire. But this is interestingly also wrong. The Roman Empire didn't really ever go away so much as the western part broke down into a bunch of pieces. But the eastern part, it just kept going, flailing violently to stay alive and slowly losing grip on its claimed territories for centuries more. And today we call that the Byzantine Empire, but they never stopped calling themselves the Roman Empire. Nobody called it the Byzantine Empire until 100 years after the capital of Constantinople was taken down by the Ottoman Empire in 1453. And even then, it's more accurate to say that broke into pieces, and different places like Russia and Romania, endless authorities in Christian and even some Muslim-ruled kingdoms across territory once claimed by ancient Rome sometimes saw themselves as, or claimed to be, still maintaining the Roman Empire. But in general, nobody was really on the same page as to what that meant, and not everyone even wanted that. A lot of people specifically didn't. At some point, a fake document was forged called the Donation of Constantine, which claimed that the Pope had been transferred supreme authority to administer the Western Roman Empire hundreds of years before. This was accepted by the Roman Emperor in Constantinople, creating what is known as the East-West Schism of the Christian Church around 1054 AD. From whence the Catholics of the West saw the Pope as the supreme religious authority on earth, and the Orthodox Christians of the East had regional bishops over whom there was no higher religious authority other than God or Jesus himself. This in turn influenced the gradual consolidation of Christian state power west of what remained of the original Christian Roman Empire. Oh yeah, and they also started taking land from that empire as well. Eventually, after hundreds of more years, using religious pressure and persecutions, massacres, wars, inquisitions, crusades, genocides, mass expulsions, forced conversions, and conquests of all kinds, the Pope-following Catholics more or less dominated a sizable, if still incredibly fractured, mass of kingdoms west of the Constantinople-based Roman Empire, which still existed. But anyway, we finally arrived, the origin of Western civilization. And it was only in the last 500 or 600 years. That's how old Western civilization is at most. Something at first only perpetuated by a handful of Roman-based or directly inspired Catholic imperialists trying very hard to build it for over 1,000 years, and usually failing disastrously. In fact, they didn't really succeed until about the end of the Middle Ages. That's how recently the distinction between Europe and the rest of the world came to have any cultural meaning. And most of it was just in the time that specifically colonial powers, high on their own stuff, started buying into their fantasy that their enlightened philosophy and aristocratic parliamentary systems, only a handful of centuries old at most, were a continuation of something which had often been replaced by despotic, monarchical, and feudal societies for over an actual 1,000 years. And you know what? It was horrible and built on racialized imperialism then, and it's horrible and built on racialized imperialism now. And worse? I'll make videos about those specifics soon. How it happened, about colonialism and anti-colonial resistance, about nationalism, and the history of systemic racism itself. But for now, I just want you to remember whenever you see or hear someone talking about Western civilization, as if it's anything to be proud of, ask them what in the heck they're talking about. If they're just talking about ancient Greece or whatever, then okay, but their version of history is severely misled. If they're just actually into the whole racist, colonial, imperialist, Christian dominion thing, then, I don't know, key their car or something at least, because they are no good. But if they're not that bad, talk to them, maybe show them this video, because the myth of Western civilization in Europe is still doing harm to all of us today, many a lot more than others, and understanding how the myth was built is an important part of dismantling that harm. I'm Phoenix Godwin, and aside from more history coming, I've got some fun pop culture stuff coming too. You can read all about it for free on my Patreon page, patreon.com/autonomousmedia. If you've got questions, let me know in the comments and I'll do my best to answer. Please subscribe to the channel, I really need any kind of support I can get. And in that vein, I want to give a huge thank you to Albert, Kaylin, Bambi, Shelly, Sandra, Sarah, Matthew, Zach, and Frank. Holy cow! Y'all are amazing. Without you, this channel would not be possible, and I promise I'm going to put your support to good use. I'll see y'all again in a couple weeks. Stay safe, stay dangerous, and as always, look out for each other.